Because understanding great literature is better than trying to read and understand yet another business book. On the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, we commit to reading, dissecting, and analyzing the great books of the Western canon. You know, those books, from Jane Austen to Shakespeare, and everything else in between that you might have fallen asleep trying to read in high school. We do this for our listeners, the owner, the entrepreneur, the manager, or the civic leader who doesn't have the time to read, dissect, analyze, and leverage insights from literature to execute leadership best practices in the confusing and chaotic postmodern world we all now inhabit. Welcome to the rescuing of Western civilization at the intersection of literature and leadership. Welcome to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. Hello, my name is Hasan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 84. With our book today, a book designed to encapsulate the pioneer experience in the Western United States post-1880s, and a book that reminds us just how young the United States continues to be. Now, back in the 1990s, on the show Seinfeld, writer and co-creator Larry David came up with a motto describing the actions and the motivations of Jerry, George, Kramer, and Elaine on the show. His motto was, and I quote, "No hugging, no learning." Our book today is the polar antithesis of such a postmodern idea. The Great Plains classic with a strong biblical Old Testament overtone. A tale of love and loss during the spring and summer of what would turn out to be a long life. My Antonia by Willa Cather. Leaders, even against an epic sweep of historical times, the small things and the small people executing those small things still matter. And we start off in the Barnes & Noble's Classics version of My Antonia by Willa Cather, with an introduction and notes by Gordon Tapper. I would encourage you to go out and pick it up. So from Book 1, Chapter 1, The Shimmerdas. I first heard of Antonia on what seemed to me an interminable journey across the great Midland Plain of North America. I was 10 years old then. I lost both my father and mother within a year, and my Virginia relatives were sending me out to my grandparents who lived in Nebraska. I traveled in the care of a mountain boy, Jake Marpole, one of the hands on my father's old farm under the Blue Ridge, who was now going west to work for my grandfather. Jake's experience of the world was not much wider than mine. He had never been in a railway train until the morning we set out together to try our fortunes in a new world. We went all the way in day coaches, becoming more sticky and grimy with each stage of the journey. Jake brought everything the newsboys offered him: candy, oranges, brass collar buttons, a watch charm, and for me, a Life of Jesse James, which I remember as one of the most satisfactory books I have ever read. Beyond Chicago, we were under the protection of a friendly passenger conductor who knew all about the country to which we were going and gave us a great deal of advice in exchange for our confidence. He seemed to us an experienced and worldly man who had been almost everywhere. In his conversation, he threw out lightly the names of distant states and cities. He wore the rings and pins and badges of different fraternal orders to which he pledged. Even his cuff buttons were engraved with hieroglyphics, and he was more inscribed than an Egyptian obelisk. Once, when he sat down to chat, he told us that the immigrant car ahead, there was a family from across the water whose destination was the same as ours. They can't any of them speak English except for one little girl, and all she can say is, "We go Black Hawk, Nebraska." She's not much older than you, 12 or 13 maybe, and she's as bright as a new dollar. Don't you want to go ahead and see her, Jimmy? She's got the pretty brown eyes, too. This last remark made me bashful, and I shook my head and settled down to Jesse James. Jake nodded at me approvingly and said you were likely to get diseases from foreigners. I do not remember crossing the Missouri River or anything about the long day's journey through Nebraska. Probably by that time I had crossed so many rivers that I was dull to them. The only thing very noticeable about Nebraska was that it was still, all day long, Nebraska. I had been sleeping curled up in a red plush seat for a long time when we reached Blackhawk. Jake roused me and took me by the hand. We stumbled down from the train to a wooden siding where men were running along with lanterns. I couldn't see any town or even distant lights. We were surrounded by utter darkness. The engine was panting heavily after its long run. In the red glow from the firebox, a group of people stood huddled together on the platform, encumbered by bundles and boxes. I knew this must be the immigrant family the conductor had told us about. The woman wore a fringed shawl tied over her head as she carried a little tin trunk in her arms, hugging it as if it were a baby. There was an old man, tall and stooped. Two half-grown boys and a girl stood holding oilcloth bundles, and a little girl clung to her mother's skirts. Presently, a man with a lantern approached them and began to talk, shouting and exclaiming. I pricked up my ears, for it was positively the first time I had ever heard a foreign tongue. Another lantern came along. A bantering voice called out, "Hello! Are you Mr. Burton's folks? If you are, it's me you're looking for. I'm Otto Fuchs. I'm Mr. Burton's hired man, and I'm to drive you out. Hello, Jimmy. Aren't you scared to come so far west?" I turned up with interest at the new face in the lantern light. He might have stepped out of the pages of Jesse James. He wore a sombrero hat with a wide leather band and a bright buckle, and the ends of his mustache were twisted up stiffly like little horns. He looked lively and ferocious, I thought, and as if he had a history. A long scar ran across one cheek and drew the corner of his mouth up in a sinister curl. The top of his left ear was gone, and his skin was as brown as an Indian's. Surely this was the face of a desperado. As he walked about the platform in his high-heeled boots, looking for our trunks, I saw that he was a rather slight man, quick and wiry and light on his feet. He told us we had a long night drive ahead of us and had better be on the hike. He led us to the hitching bar where 2 farm wagons were tied, and I saw the foreign family crowding into one of them. The other one was for us. Jake got on the front seat with Otto Fuchs, and I rode on the straw in the bottom of the wagon box, covered up with a buffalo hide. The immigrants rumbled off into the empty darkness, and we followed them. I tried to go to sleep, but the jolting made me bite my tongue, and I soon began to ache all over. When the straw settled down, I had a hard bed. Cautiously, I slipped from under the buffalo hide and got up on my knees and peered over the side of the wagon. There seemed to be nothing to see. No fences, no creeks or trees, no hills or fields. If there was a road, I could not make it out in the faint starlight. There was nothing but land, not a country at all, but the material out of which countries are made. No, there was nothing but land, slight, undulating, I knew, because often our wheels ground against the brake as we went down into a hollow and lurched up again the other side. I had a feeling that the world was left behind, that we had gotten over the edge of it and were outside man's jurisdiction. I had never looked up before at the sky when there was not a familiar mountain ridge against it. But this was the complete dome of heaven, all there was of it. I did not believe that my dead father and mother were watching me from up there. They would still be looking for me in the sheepfold down by the creek or along the white road that led to the mountain pastures. I had left even their spirits behind me. The wagon jolted on, carrying me I knew not whither. I don't think I was homesick. If we never arrived anywhere, it did not matter. Between that earth and that sky, I felt erased, blotted out. I did not say my prayers that night here. I felt what would be, would be. Willa Cather, born December 7th, 1873. She died April 24th, 1947, was a writer of the late Romantic period of American letters, and interestingly enough, a favorite of my grandma. My grandma really loved Willa Cather's writing, and I was exposed to a lot of it as a child. she sought in her writing to bridge the gap between Walt Whitman and the post-Civil War writers of American expansion across the West and fundamentally across the globe as America, particularly post-World War I America, began to be more astride and behave more astride the international stage. Willa Cather was consumed with framing and romanticizing and explaining the spirit of pioneer settlers moving into the Western states, which, by the way, in the years between 1880 and 1920 were still wild, and they were those areas of the country, Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, certain areas of Oklahoma, and even West Texas, those areas that were still considered to be wild, still considered to be part of the West in the public imagination of people on the East Coast, most of those areas were populated by European immigrants, which many of them came from places like Norway, Sweden, Russia, Czechoslovakia, Prussia, and many, many other countries in Eastern Europe. What Cather documented was the impact at a narrative level, the impact of that old world, the really old world, that really old Eastern European world, that mindset coming to a place where the land was fertile, the Native Americans had been cleared out pretty much effectively, and everything where the land, well, all they knew how to do was work the land. Cather, as a female writer, just like Pearl Buck and Virginia Woolf, loathed to have her literary talent compared or lumped in with other female writers. She actively rejected that. She sought to carve out her literary achievements and placed her contributions firmly in competition against male writers of her era. Now, Cather was very much influenced by Henry James, as was almost every other writer during the latter part of, almost every other American writer anyway, during the latter part of the 19th century. But the male writers of her era included, of course, James Joyce, Thornton Wilder, William Faulkner, Ernest Hemingway, many of those folks that we have covered here on the podcast or that we will be covering in upcoming episodes. But she placed herself in that spot, and she was judged worthy of being in that spot, being among that august company. She did not think that her first book was good and sought to make every other book better. She regarded most women writers, most female writers, with disdain, judging them overly sentimental, with the exception of course, Jane Austen. And we covered Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility on one of our episodes of this podcast. I would recommend going back and listening to that, finding that in the catalog. But she valued Austen, but then most other female writers she kind of tossed away. Now, we live in a postmodern era where the personal is political, and where the private and public spheres of an artist have collapsed together. And we expect, in an attempt to be transparent, that all writers, all artists, all creators will give us their internal dialogue. We believe that we are owed it as the audience now. Now, I fundamentally believe that we're not. I believe we're owed a show, and that's about it. And interestingly enough, Willa Cather also believed that you were owed a show, but you were not owed her life. A resolutely private person, Cather destroyed many drafts, personal papers, and letters, and she asked many people who she wrote letters to or wrote personal drafts for or just communicated with to do the same. The writings that have survived from people that did not honor her request reveal a deep emotional attachment to women. Now, let's get this out of the way early. Was Willa Cather a lesbian? Probably. And so what? Which is what she would say. She didn't believe that that particular thing of who she decided to make a life with had any relevance to her art. She was from a different time. We now believe that all of that is the only lens through which we can judge a person's artistic contributions. Because Cather didn't care about the kind of stuff we care about as postmoderns, she's often relegated to being part of the reading of high school students, if they read her at all. This is a real shame because Cather combined a sense of place with nostalgia and Midwestern exile, and she was able to go past nihilism and really understand, which by the way was beginning to attach itself to American writing in the 1880s all the way through the 1920s, and really that existentialist slash nihilist, and yes, I know they're not the same thing, but these two approaches to fiction really sort of came together with the writers of the lost generation of the fin de siècle, writers like Fitzgerald and Hemingway, who thought that she was just naive and unimportant. She was even starting to decline in her own time. Well, Cather's fiction was really consumed with, like I said, physical landscapes and nostalgia and Midwestern exile. And she combined all of this and encapsulated it in, of course, domestic spaces. And these acted as dynamic presences, particularly in My Antonia, where her characters struggled. And we'll see this today in our selections from My Antonia, where her characters struggle to find community, to connect with others, and here's something that makes her an anti-nihilist writer, to make meaning. All of Cather's characters are seeking to make meaning using the old traditions that they came from, transplanted to this new place, and then figuring out how to move forward, rather than just abandoning everything and wandering aimlessly through a spiritually wasted landscape. Cather did get her accolades in her lifetime. She received a Pulitzer Prize in 1923 for her novel based on World War I, which Ernest Hemingway widely panned, One of Ours. And her most famous novel, one that I read back in high school when I was maybe 13 or 14, her most famous novel was Death Comes for the Archbishop. I would strongly recommend you picking that one up, which was published in 1927, and I believe it sold somewhere around 850,000 copies, which makes it a slam dunk by any measure. This is who we are looking at on the podcast today. This is Willa Cather. And so let us take a deep dive into the very biblically oriented and the very Old Testament-like My Antonia. Back to the book, back to My Antonia. We're still in book one. We're talking about the Shimerdas. We're introduced to them. And we are on, we're going to move to chapter 7 in My Antonia, picking up our reading here. And once again, as I always say on this podcast, we are not reading the whole book. We can't possibly do that. Matter of fact, I recommend you go pick it up. I recommend you go listen to the audiobook version of this. We are just reading excerpts from My Antonia, and then we are examining them through a lens of leadership, through a lens of understanding about worldviews and about postures, so that we can make better decisions as leaders in our fractured times. Back to the book. We were examining a big hole with two entrances. The burrow, and by the way, this is now on the farm, right? Where Jim is living with Antonia. He's met Antonia. He's met the Shimmerdaws. He's also met his grandfather and his grandmother, and he's getting inculcated into the community. And so we're picking this up in, like I said, in chapter 7. We were examining a big hole with two entrances. The burrow sloped into the ground at a gentle angle so that we could see where the two corridors united, and the floor was dusty from use, like a little highway over which much travel went. I was walking backward in a crouching position when I heard Antonia scream. She was standing opposite me, pointing behind me and shouting something in Bohemian. I whirled round, and there, on one of those dry gravel beds, was the biggest snake I had ever seen. He was sunning himself after the cold night, and he must have been asleep when Antonia screamed. When I turned, he was lying in long, loose waves like a letter W. He twitched and began to coil slowly. He was not merely a big snake, I thought. He was a circus monstrosity. His abdominal muscularity, his loathsome fluid motion somehow made me sick. He was as thick as my leg and looked as if millstones couldn't crush the disgusting vitality out of him. He lifted his hideous little head and rattled. I didn't run because I didn't think of it. If my back had been against a stone wall, I couldn't have felt more cornered. I saw his coils tighten. Now he would spring his length. I remembered. I ran up and drove at his head with my spade, struck him fairly across the neck, and in a minute he was all about my feet in wavy loops. I struck now from hate. Antonia, barefooted as she was, ran up behind me. Even after I pounded his ugly head flat, his body kept on coiling and winding, doubling and falling back on itself. I walked away and turned my back. I felt seasick. Antonia came after me, crying, "Oh, Jimmy, he not bite you? You sure? Why you not run when I say?" "What did you jabber bohunk for? You might have told me there was a snake behind me," I said petulantly. "I know, I am just awful, Jim. I was so scared." She took my handkerchief from my pocket and tried to wipe my face with it, but I snatched it away from her. I suppose I looked as sick as I felt. "I never know you was so brave, Jim," she went on comfortingly. "You just like big mans. You wait for him to lift his head, then you go for him. Ain't you scared a bit? Now we take that snake home and show everybody. Nobody ain't seen in this country so big snake like you kill." She went on like this strain until I began to think that I had longed for this opportunity and inhaled it with joy. Cautiously, we went back to the snake. He was still groping with his tail, turning up his ugly belly in the light. A faint, fetid smell came from him, and a thread of green liquid oozed from his crushed head. "Look, Tony, that's his poison," I said. I took a long piece of string from my pocket as she lifted his head with a spade while I tied a noose around it. We pulled him out straight and measured him by my riding quirt. He was about 5.5 feet long. He had 12 rattles, but they were broken off before they began to taper. So I insisted that he must once have had 24. I explained to Antonia how this meant that he was 24 years old, that he must have been there when white men first came, left on from Buffalo in Indian times. As I turned him over, I began to feel proud of him, to have kind of respect for his age and size. He seemed like the ancient eldest evil. Certainly his kind have left horrible, unconscious memories in all warm-blooded life. When we dragged him down into the draw, Dude sprang off to the end of his tether and shivered all over, wouldn't let us come near him. We decided that Antonia should ride Dude home, and I would walk. As she rode along slowly, her bare legs swinging against the pony's side, she kept shouting back to me about how astonished everybody would be. I followed with the spade over my shoulder, dragging my snake. Her exultation was contagious. The great land had never looked to me so big and free. If the red grass were full of rattlers, I was equal to them all. Nevertheless, I stole furtive glances behind me now and then to see that no avenging mate, older and bigger than my quarry, was racing up from the rear. The sun had set when we reached our garden and went down the draw toward the house. Otto Fuchs was the first one we met. He was sitting on the edge of the cattle pond having a quiet pipe before supper. Antonia called him to come quick and look. He did not say anything for a minute, but scratched his head and turned the snake over with his boot. "Where did you run onto that beauty, Jim?" "Up at the dog town," I answered laconically. "Kill him yourself? How come you have no weapon?" "I've been up to Russian Peter's to borrow a spade for Ambrose." Otto shook the ashes out of his pipe and squatted down to count the rattles. "It was just luck you had a tool," he said cautiously. Gosh, I wouldn't want to do any business with that fellow myself unless I had a fence post along. Your grandmother's snake cane wouldn't be more than a tickle to him. He could stand right up and talk to you, he could. Did he fight hard? Antonia broke in. He fights something awful. He is all over Jimmy's boots. I screamed for him to run, but he just hit and hit that snake like he was crazy. Otto winked at me. Even after Antonia rode on, he said, got him in the head the first crack, didn't you? Well, that was just as well. We hung him up on the windmill, and when I went down to the kitchen, I found Antonia standing in the middle of the floor, telling the story with a great deal of color. Subsequent experiences with rattlesnakes taught me that my first encounter was fortunate in circumstance. My big rattler was old, and he had led too easy a life. There was not much fight in him. He had probably lived there for years, with a fat prairie dog for breakfast whenever he felt like it, a sheltered home, even an owl feather bed perhaps, and he had forgot that the world doesn't owe rattlers a living. A snake of his size, in fighting trim, would be more than any boy could handle. So in reality, it was a mock adventure. The game was fixed for me by chance, as it probably was for many a dragon slayer. I had been adequately armed by Russian Peter. The snake was old and lazy, and I had Antonia beside me to appreciate and admire. So the character Jim in this clip that we just read, where he rescues Antonia from the snake, and even he admits the game may have been a little rigged for him. This occurs during a time in the narrative when Antonia and Jim have gotten past their initial uncomfortableness at getting to know each other, and now they are entering into more of a matured relationship. Now, Jim is still a kid, right? And so is Antonia. She's no more than maybe 13 or 14 at this point, and he's maybe no more than 10 or 11. But there is a structural difference in the Midwest here. There's, the structural difference between men and women and the necessity of male strength in order to accomplish goals, which is something, of course, that we have left behind in our very, very postmodern world. We don't believe in the necessity of male strength anymore to accomplish goals. And yet, when a jar needs to be opened or a ditch needs to be dug, women aren't doing that. Jim rescues Antonia from the big rattlesnake in the Gopher neighborhood. And with this act, he cements himself, at least initially, as a man. Now, what will happen subsequent to this in the narrative, just to sort of give you an idea of what's coming up, is as the Shimerda's lives change, right? Antonia will begin to take on more masculine aspects. And some of this can be seen as, and many critics have said this, some of this can be seen as reflecting Cather's the masculine nature of Cather's sexuality and of her dress. I prefer to think of it in terms of Antonia now takes on more of, particularly late in book one, takes on more of the leadership posture of a man, because there are, other than her brother, there's no other available males for her to role model herself against. And Jim is not going to do that, because Jim, even though he killed the snake, is still younger than her. And there's this dynamic of youth and almost feminine characters that is given to Jim versus age and almost masculine character that's given to Antonia, sets up the tensions that eventually come to a head much later in the novel. By contrast, there's a character named Lena Lingard, and she shows up later on in a town called Blackhawk, the town that Jim came through. Well, that and before he went to the farm that was further west in Nebraska. Well, he's going to go back to that town, and we're going to talk about that in a few moments. Him and his family, his grandparents, are going to go back to that town when the farm gets to be too hard to work on after several years, and they're going to set up in Blackhawk. And Lena Lingard sits in Blackhawk. Jim runs into her, and Lena is a Lilith character as opposed to Antonia's character, who is much more oriented towards Eve. And this is where you begin to see the genuine biblical influences, the genuine Old Testament influences on Willa Cather in her writing. These stand out very, very strongly, not necessarily if you know where to look, just if you know how to read people who are writing in a pre-postmodern era, at the beginning of the modernist era. Once again, Cather's a romantic, and what she's romanticizing this rescue for sure, which is biblical in nature and on purpose. And it is a transitional moment that allows Jim and Antonia to begin to traverse out of childhood and to begin to fall into history. That fall into history marks all adolescent relationships. And this is where the lesson for leaders arises in My Antonia. Leaders rescue their people from snakes in the garden, even if those snakes are fat, lazy, corrupted, and don't look like they're that much of a problem. Leaders recognize the snakes, and they act quickly to destroy their heads and to remove them from the community before they can eat out house and home. They close the door to prisons of sin and prisons of mistakes, where people may be languishing inside, becoming fat and corrupt. And if the circumstances make the rescuing easy, all the better. Let's not hold Providence accountable for the actions that we commit, whether good or bad. Back to the book, back to My Antonia. So we're going to move around a bit for this next part. The character of Jim's grandfather reveals something very important that I think leaders should recognize about patriarchy at the edge of modernism. I'm going to read several different sections in this book, starting in chapter 12. On Christmas morning, when I got down to the kitchen, the men were just coming in from their morning chores. The horses and pigs always had their breakfast before we did. Jake and Otto shouted "Merry Christmas" to me and winked at each other when they saw the waffle irons on the stove. Grandfather came down wearing a white shirt and his Sunday coat. Morning prayers were longer than usual. He read the chapters from St. Matthew about the birth of Christ, and as we listened, it all seemed like something that had happened lately and near at hand. In his prayer, he thanked the Lord for the first Christmas and for all that it had meant to the world ever since. He gave thanks for our food and comfort and prayed for the poor and destitute in great cities, where the struggle for life was harder than it was here with us. Grandfather's prayers were often very interesting. He had the gift of simple and moving expression. Because he talked so little, his words had a peculiar force. They were not worn dull from constant use. His prayers reflected what he was thinking about at the time, and it was chiefly through them that we got to know his feelings and his views about things. Then we're going to move a little bit further ahead, still in Book 1. We're going to go to the back end of Chapter 15. Grandfather had explained to Ambrose that someday, when the country was put under fence and roads were confined to section lines, 2 roads would cross exactly on that corner. By the way, this explanation that Grandfather is giving to Ambrose, the oldest son of the Shmiridas, occurs after Mr. Shmirida either commits suicide or is murdered. That's somewhat murky. And is in the barn, and they are arranging for his burial. Jim's family is arranging for his burial with the Shmiridas. Back to the book. Because Mrs. Shmirida and Ambrose wanted the old man wanted Mr. Shmirida buried at the crossroads of a road. Okay, or not the crossroads of a road. Sorry, the crossroads of the country where a road would one day be. Okay, that's what Grandfather is talking about them with here. Grandfather had explained to Ambrose that someday, when the country was put under fence and the roads were confined to section lines, 2 roads would cross exactly on that corner. But Ambrose only said, "It makes no matter." Grandfather asked Jelinek whether in the old country there was some superstition to the effect that a suicide must be buried at the crossroads. Jelinek said he didn't know. He seemed to remember hearing that there had once been such a custom in Bohemia. Mrs. Shmirida's made up her mind, he added. I try to persuade her and say it looks bad for her to all the neighbors, but she say it must so be. There I will bury him, if I dig the grave myself, she say. I have to promise her I help Ambrose make the grave tomorrow. Grandfather smoothed his beard and looked judicial. I don't know whose wish should decide the matter if not hers, but if she thinks she will live to see the people of this country ride over that old man's head, she is mistaken. And then moving a little bit further ahead in Chapter 16 to the actual funeral of Mr. Shmirida, Grandfather has been asked to say a prayer at the grave. Grandmother looked anxiously at Grandfather. He took off his hat, and the other men did likewise. I thought his prayer remarkable. I still remember it. He began, O great and just God, no man among us knows what the sleeper knows, nor is it for us to judge what lies between him and thee. He prayed that if any man there had been remiss toward the stranger come to a far country, God would forgive him and soften his heart. He recalled the promises to the widow and the fatherless and asked God to smooth the way before this widow and her children, and to incline the hearts of men to deal justly with her. In closing, he said, we were leaving Mr. Shmirida at thy judgment seat, which is also thy mercy seat. All the time he was praying, Grandmother watched him through the black fingers of her glove, and when he said amen, I thought she looked satisfied with him. And then a little further on, now we've got Ambrose working the farm, and Grandfather and Grandmother tried to help the Shmiridas with supplying them with livestock and with a little bit of help with handymen, Jake and Otto. And at this point, there's a little bit of conflict that has erupted because Mrs. Shmirida is a particular kind of woman. And Ambrose, the son, is also a particular kind of individual. When Ambrose came back from Mr. Bushy's, we learned that he had given Merrick's wages to a priest at Blackhawk for masses for their father's soul. Grandmother thought Antonia needed shoes more than Mr. Shmirida needed prayers, but Grandfather said tolerantly, if he can spare $6, pinched as he is, it shows he believes what he professes. It was Grandfather who brought about a reconciliation with the Shmiridas. One morning he told us that the small grain was coming in so well he thought he would begin to cut his wheat on the 1st of July. He would need more men, and if it were agreeable to everyone, he would engage Ambrose for the reaping and threshing, as the Shmiridas had no small grain of their own. I think, Emmeline, he concluded, I will ask Antonia to come over and help you in the kitchen. She'll be glad to earn something, and it will be a good time to end misunderstandings. I may as well ride over this morning and make arrangements. Do you want to go with me, Jim? His tone told me that he had already decided for me. After breakfast, we set off together. When Mrs. Schmierda saw us coming, she ran from her door down into the draw behind the stable, as if she did not want to meet us. Grandfather smiled to himself while he tied his horse, and we followed her. Behind the barn, we came upon a funny sight. The cow had evidently been grazing somewhere in the draw. Mrs. Schmierda had run up to the animal, pulled up the lariat pin, and when we came upon her, she was trying to hide the cow in an old cave in the bank. As the hole was narrow and dark, the cow held back, and the old woman was slapping and pushing at her hind quarters, trying to spank her into the draw side. Grandfather ignored her singular occupation and greeted her politely. "Good morning, Mrs. Schmierda. Can you tell me where I will find Ambrose? Which field?" "He with the sod corn." She pointed toward the north, still standing in front of the cow, as if she had hoped to conceal it. "His sod corn will be good for fodder this winter," said Grandfather encouragingly. "And where is Antonia?" "She go with." Mrs. Schmierda kept wiggling her bare feet about nervously in the dust. "Very well, I will ride up there. I want them to come over and help me cut my oats and wheat next month. I will pay them wages. Good morning." "By the way, Mrs. Schmierda," he said as he turned up the path, "I think we may as well call it square. About the cow." She started and clutched the rope tighter. Seeing that she did not understand, Grandfather turned back. "You need not pay me anything more. No more money. The cow is yours." "Pay no more, keep cow?" she asked in a bewildered tone, her narrow eyes snapping at us in the sunlight. "Exactly. Pay no more. Keep cow." He nodded. Mrs. Schmierda dropped the rope, ran after us, and, crouching down beside Grandfather, she took his hand and kissed it. I doubt if he had ever been so much embarrassed before. I was a little startled, too. Somehow, that seemed to bring the old world very close. We rode away, laughing, and Grandfather said, "I expect she thought we had come to take the cow away for certain, Jim. I wonder if she wouldn't have scratched a little if we'd laid hold of that lariat rope." Willa Cather was, in comparison or maybe in opposition to the times in which we live now as an artist, fundamentally conservative in her politics and progressive in early 20th century terms in how she viewed religion, how she viewed belief and tradition. Grandfather is representative of all of this as a character particularly in book one, where his character is really solidified, and then in the subsequent rest of the novel. Cather, like most artists who came before the last, I would say, 20 or 30 years, recognized the nature of reality, and she felt emotionally that a shift was occurring in how modernity perceived masculinity. She felt this shift approaching, but she didn't really know what to do with it, and I think it disturbed her greatly. That's why Jim's character struggles with attraction and love and loss to Antonia, but then also falls into the grips of Lena Lingard. There's many masculine characters that represent many different aspects of masculinity in My Antonia, and they're fully realized characters. So not only Jim and Grandfather, but also the ranch hands Jake and Otto, Mr. Schmierda's, Ambrose, and many other folks, right? and Mr. Harling in book 2. And you get different aspects, you get different embodiments of what masculinity actually is. And Cather is wrestling with something through these fully realized characters that I believe many modern writers fail to wrestle with. Grandfather is the wise patriarch. That's how he stands. He's gentle, he's introspective, he's forgiving, and above all, as we saw with the cow, he's just. This doesn't mean he's fair. It just means he's just. He represents the last of the strong, silent type of man that existed and was necessary to exist on the plains of the United States in the late 19th century. As a matter of fact, when Jim reflects on the prayer that grandfather said during Christmas, he says, and I quote, "His prayers reflected what he was thinking about at the time. It was chiefly through them that we got to know his feelings and his views about things. And because he talked so little, his words had a peculiar force. They were not worn dull from constant use." We live in a time where our words are worn dull from constant use. And yes, I realize that I'm on a podcast where talking is necessary. And yes, I recognize that I have made my living in training and development from, well, quite frankly, from spouting air, so I'm not unaware of it. And I love words. I love language. I love having good conversations with people. I love having interesting conversations with interesting people, or just having interesting conversations with, I shouldn't say just having, drawing people into interesting conversations. But grandfather represents a different paradigm of patriarchy, a paradigm that exists still, even in our world today, in the form of, as I've said repeatedly on this podcast, the folks who do our blue-collar work, right? Our carpenters, our construction workers, our garbage men, our plumbers, at the highest end, our electricians, our mechanics. Look, these are people who act with action, who express themselves with doing. And in a world like Nebraska, in a world where the harshness of reality is such that people in the city feel luckier than people in the town, and people in the town feel luckier than people in the country, the prayer, of course, that the grandfather says is one where he prayed for the poor and destitute in great cities where the struggle for life was harder than it was here with us. That's interesting. The struggle for life is harder in the cities because here in the country, we can wrest reality. We can wrest the struggle from the land, and the land is more forgiving than the city. That's pre-modern patriarchy. That's something that we have forgotten. Jim, on the other hand, and so does Mr. Shmierda. Mr. Shmierda came from the old country, was a violinist, was a man of letters, a man of intellect. He could not farm. He could hunt, but he could not farm. He wasn't trained in how to do the basics, and he wasn't wired in a way that was going to have him go out and fight the land. And so he died, either by his own hand or because of murder. But either way, he perished. Mr. Shmierda is a bridge between grandfather and Jim. Jim represents a turn towards the more modernist way that we think of patriarchy that really began in the early 20th century. Jim will go to college, or people in Jim's generation will go to war, and then return to America or stay stranded in Europe and remain traumatized by World War I and become what Gertrude Stein would later call all part of a lost generation. This would begin. Jim was the beginning, and Willa Cather saw this. Jim was the beginning of the cycling towards something that fully realized its apotheosis in the 1960s with the baby boomer generation and which has now come to its logical end with the nattering nabobs on TikTok of Gen Z. What are leaders to make from all of this? Well, here's a big one. There's still a need for strong, silent, patriarchal leadership. There's still a need for a wise, just hand, introspective and forgiving, to guide the ship of state, the ship of the neighborhood, or even the ship of family. And too many words, or maybe words overbalancing action, are not necessarily what we need right now. What we need is leadership. Back to the book, back to my Antonia. We're rounding the corner here on the book. And again, not reading the whole thing, not even close. I would recommend you go out and pick up the Barnes & Noble Classics edition with the introduction and notes by Gordon Tapper. It's got plenty of footnotes in it. Go get this book. So we're going to pick up from book 2, chapter 1. A little bit of a change is occurring here in Jem's life. I had been living with my grandfather for nearly 3 years when he decided to move to Black Hawk. He and grandmother were getting old for the heavy work of a farm, and as I was now 13, they thought I ought to be going to school. Accordingly, our homestead was rented to that good woman, the widow Stevens, and her bachelor brother, and we brought Preacher White's house at the north end of Black Hawk. This was the first townhouse one passed driving in from the farm, a landmark which told country people their long ride was over. We were to move to Black Hawk in March, and as soon as grandfather had fixed the date, he let Jake and Otto know of his intention. Otto said he would not be likely to find another place that suited him so well that he was tired of farming and thought he would go back to what he called the Wild West. Jake Marple, lured by Otto's stories of adventure, decided to go with him. We did our best to dissuade Jake. He was so handicapped by illiteracy and by his trusting disposition that he would be an easy prey to sharpers. Grandmother begged him to stay among kindly Christian people where he was known, but there was no reasoning with him. He wanted to be a prospector. He thought a silver mine was waiting for him in Colorado. Jake and Otto served us to the last. They moved us into town and put down the carpets in our new house, made shelves and cupboards for grandmother's kitchen, and seemed loath to leave us. But at last they went without a warning. Those two fellows had been faithful to us through sun and storm, had given us things that cannot be bought in any market in the world. With me, they had been like older brothers, had restrained their speech and manners out of care for me, and had given me so much good comradeship. Now they got on the westbound train one morning in their Sunday clothes with their oilcloth valises, and I never saw them again. Months afterward, we got a card from Otto saying that Jake had been down with mountain fever, but now they were both working in the Yankee Girl mine and were doing well. I wrote to them at that address, but my letter was returned to me unclaimed. After that, we never heard from them. Black Hawk, the new world in which we had come to live, was clean, well-planted little prairie town with white fences and good green yards about the dwellings, wide, dusty streets, and shapely little trees growing along the wooden sidewalks. In the center of the town, there were 2 rows of new brick store buildings, a brick schoolhouse, a courthouse, and 4 white churches. Our own house looked down over the town. And from our upstairs windows, we could see the winding line of the river bluffs 2 miles south of us. That river was to be my compensation for the lost freedom of the farming country. We came to Black Hawk in March, and by the end of April, we felt like town people. Grandfather was a deacon in the new Baptist church. Grandmother was busy with church suppers and missionary societies, and I was quite another boy, or thought I was. Suddenly put down among boys of my own age, I found I had a great deal to learn. Before the spring term of school was over, I could fight, play keeps, tease the little girls, and use forbidden words as well as any boy in my class. I was restrained from utter savagery only by the fact that Mrs. Harling, our nearest neighbor, kept an eye on me. And if my behavior went beyond certain bounds, I was not permitted to come into her yard or to play with her jolly children. Just as Lot in the Bible moved his family from the plains of the Promised Land in Genesis 13:12 and 19:15, grandfather took the bold move for different reasons, but the bold move to move the family and Jim to Black Hawk. Now, this move in my Antonia, this move, as it is written, as it is narratively drawn out by Willa Cather, represents, in a very Old Testament way, a descent from the paradise of the Great Plains to the potential Sodom and Gomorrah of the town. The Sodom and Gomorrah temptations of the big city of Black Hawk, which of course stands in for Sodom. This is where Black Hawk is where Jim comes into his own, right? Jim begins to become a man. And it's no accident that Cather has grandfather become a deacon, has grandmother go off and deal with and become engaged with missionary exploits. And it's no accident that Jim then has to be protected from, as he frames it in the book, utter savagery. This is what the town brings out. By the way, this is what people of the plains are suspicious of. This is what people of the Midwest are still suspicious of. Yes, the Midwest is full of large cities: St. Louis, Minneapolis, Chicago, Detroit, Des Moines, Kearney. Yes, I threw Kearney in there. Omaha, Oklahoma City, and of course, Dallas-Fort Worth, which will be probably the second or third largest metropolis in the United States by 2040. But all that big city living doesn't allow for understanding the land. It also wipes away tradition, and Cather knew this. This is why I say Jim stands in as an avatar of the upcoming modernist conception of what patriarchy can be. The other thing that we note is that Antonia does not change. Antonia begins to work on the farm at the end of book 1. She begins to adopt the mannerisms of her brother and begins to appeal to her brother and begins to work as hard as her brother in an attempt to provide for her family. And Antonia stays on the farm, does not go to town, at least not initially, and she develops into a woman that's not quite fit to be married. Now, many critics have taken from this that, this was Cather's commentary on the sexual mores of her time and the straitjacket she may have found herself in personally and with her orientation. But I think that's a very claptrap kind of reading of this shift that's occurring. I think it's actually more about Antonia representing Eve and representing the stalwart bulwark against descending into history. A reminder of where Jim came from and who Jim used to be. Leaders, what can you learn from this moment at the end of book 1 and going into book 2? Well, what you could take from this is that, as I said before, physical place really does matter. And the descent into history that we do based on physical place can definitely be thrust upon us. And if we are unready and unwilling to accept the terms that this is going to come on, we can fall into utter savagery, particularly when other people who may have our best interests are distracted by both good and godly things. What can we take from My Antonia by Willa Cather? What can we take from these few clips that we have read? What insights can leaders take from the work of Willa Cather? And by the way, wrote a lot of books, not just about the Midwest, but about a lot of different places, and it's worthwhile to pick up her entire catalog and to check it out. I think one of the first things we can learn is from the life of Willa Cather herself. Leaders, it's okay to be private in an increasingly public world. As a matter of fact, I would assert it's necessary. Necessary to drop out, to avoid the chatter, to reject the dominant narrative that says you must be everywhere all of the time. I believe the term is omnichannel. Your business might need to be, but you do not. The other thing that I think we can pull, particularly from book 1 that we read here today, is that leaders rescue their people from the snakes in the garden. They recognize what those snakes are and who those snakes are, and they go about the process of rescuing, and they do it whether the snake has the advantage or not. We still need the patriarchal ideal, and we still need that ideal embodied in men who will do hard work and will do the hard things that are necessary for that ideal to come to fruition, for that ideal to be made manifest. Leaders, it's your job to embody that ideal. Both men and women can embody the patriarchal ideal, by the way. It's just women may have a little bit of a difficult time figuring out how to manifest that. And finally, if you're, and this is relevant to our time, particularly with remote work and hybrid work, if you are a person who can recognize the cities of Sodom and can recognize their problems, why would you move closer to them? This is a dynamic that has only recently arrived back at our culture post-2020, because for around 20 to 30 years pre-COVID, Americans were pretty much staying in place. They weren't really going anywhere. COVID pushed us out of our comfort zones in more ways than one, and it really pushed us to get in our wagons or get on our trains or our planes or in our automobiles, pack up everything, and drive away from Sodom. Now, some of us picked other Sodoms to go towards, and a city is still a city, whether it's in the deep south or in the rusted out northeast. But the point still stands. Leaders, encourage your followers to be smarter than Lot, to be wiser than Lot. And if you are running a business or have an enterprise that requires you to be in Sodom, set up an overwatch position the way grandfather did on the hill. Say your prayers and gird your loins, and then get deeply involved in making that Sodom something more than its base desires. And well, that's it for me. Thank you for listening and subscribing to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. If you're listening to this on any of the major podcast players, like iTunes, Google Podcasts, or Spotify, please go ahead and leave us a 5-star review and write a little bit in there. A couple of sentences is good enough. That actually helps us game those algorithms that I was just maybe addressing. And, of course, it helps us grow the show. Tell all your family, tell all your friends, and tell the leaders in your life that you know that need to be listening to this show that this show exists. By the way, if you want to get started on the leadership path yourself, or you know some people who need to go on the leadership path, HSCT Publishing, the home company of Leadership Toolbox and Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, can help you and your team do that. So check out our training webinars, coaching services, and more at leadershiptoolbox.us. We are remote, we're live, we're in person, we're on video, and we've got leadership development solutions for your civic group, nonprofit staff, public sector staff, or even your private sector leaders. And of course, you're going to want to check out our video-based subscription service at leadingkeys.com. That's leadingkeys.com for leadership development on demand. You don't like videos, you don't like training, but you really like the podcast? Well, I would also recommend reading a book. Matter of fact, I'd recommend reading my most recent book, 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership. You can get that in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Ingram Spark, and any other place that you order books online. Finally, of course, we're on YouTube just like everybody else is. We'd love to have you help us grow the YouTube channel, so like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the HSCT Publishing channel on YouTube. Just search for HSCT Publishing, or you can search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button. Subscribing helps us grow the show, as it does with the audio, just is the same with the video. All right, that's it for me.